Hello, everybody. Ian Collins is my name, and welcome to today's Monday Lunch Live. Obviously, due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, we remain in webinar mode rather than face-to-face. But as we'll see through today's conversation, that may have benefits in terms of the wider reach of this discussion. Today, we're going to talk about adopting the teletrials model for safe trial delivery, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. I'm going to kick us off with an introduction, and then we'll hear from two different speakers following a panel session where we get to discuss any questions that you might have. I'll start with acknowledgements of country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the VCCC is located. I'd also like to pay my respect to elders, both past, present, future, and emerging, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present online. My name is Ian Collins. I'm a medical oncologist in Southwest Oncology in Warrnambool. I'm also the Deputy Regional Oncology Lead for the VCCC. And for the last number of years, I've been working with the VCCC and the Teletrials Committee in the development and rollout of teletrials. Before we start, I'd like to do some housekeeping. And we have some upcoming events from the VCCC, including on Friday, there's the COVID-19 and Cancer in Victoria, about enhancing your communication skills for telehealth delivery. And then next week, which is the VCCC Breast Grand Rounds, talking about CAR T cells in breast cancer with Dr. Paul Beavis. All of these events are available online, either live as we are today or from the Learn section of the VCCC website. If you do have any questions during this, obviously this is not face-to-face and it's quite off-putting sitting here talking to myself on the camera. So it would be good to get feedback from the audience to know that people are out there listening and are paying attention. If you do have any questions throughout the webinar, if you go to the question section with a question mark over the toolbar of your GoToWebinar on your device, you can enter questions in there at any stage. And when we get to the panel session towards the end of today's session, we'll aim to answer any questions that you might have that we haven't already covered. So welcome everybody today to our discussion regarding teletrials as a future and new and current way of delivering clinical trials in the going forward. So I guess the first question that we're often asked is, what's the difference between telehealth and teletrials? Telehealth, as we all know, and that's probably one of the biggest benefits we've seen from this COVID-19 pandemic, teletrials have now become a standard of care in terms of how we deliver cancer care, not just in regional or rural Australia, but across Victoria, across the world, in fact. Cancer care is now being delivered via telehealth. Telehealth has been around for a long time. For many years, patients who were unable to access metro sites, for example, were able to use telehealth to see their specialists and receive some of their care in that way. We know that 100% of cancer services now in Victoria are providing some version of telehealth for their ongoing cancer care. And we know for the vast majority of patients, it's a very effective way of delivering cancer care. It's of course not for everybody. There are times where a patient needs to be seen or examined. There are some conversations that are much easier to have in a face-to-face mode rather than using telehealth. But it has allowed us to provide the same quality of care to cancer patients without the need for face-to-face consultations and the associated viral risks associated with that. And we know that that's had a big benefit for many patients. But if we can extend that and I guess build on the momentum that the COVID-19 crisis has given us from a telehealth point of view, the next logical step after that is what we call teletrials. So teletrials is not a new concept. It's part of the telehealth process, yes? But it's a model that allows a teletrial, a clinical trial, to be delivered to patients regardless of where they are. We know that there are significant disparities between cancer outcomes for regional and rural patients compared to those in metropolitan areas. We know, in fact, that consistently for the last 10 years or so, there's been a 5% worse survival for patients, for all comers, in regional and rural areas compared to metro. And that equates to a significant number of people dying simply because of where they live. We know that clinical trials is a one element of that disparity, and it's something that we think we can use technology like telehealth to address that and hopefully reduce that gap. So teletrials is not a new clinical trial system. It is simply a tool we can use to deliver that clinical trial without the need for travel. And it's designed as a partnership between the clinical trial site, the primary site, and any other satellite or subsequent site that may be involved in the patient care. And this structure allows for specific parts of the clinical trial to be delivered locally where possible. So it doesn't mean that you have to do all of the clinical trial at all sites. We know that it'll vary depending on capabilities. So as with this diagram, you can see that it might be that the patient gets their drug delivery, their blood tests, their medications, their scans, their documentation can all be done at the primary site. And that's all the usual clinical trial elements that we can commonly deliver. But it might be that at a number of other sites, we can do drug delivery and blood testing, for example, or scans and documentation of the CRFs. And each site is able to provide what they're capable of doing to the patient and minimize the need for that patient to travel. And we know that that can have significant benefits to patients in terms of reducing the burden on them and their carers. And Kathleen will talk in a little bit about the consumer or the patient element of teletrials and how that can be beneficial. But we know it also makes practical sense to minimize the burden on your central site. If you can offload some of that work to another site, then that's going to increase the amount of capability you have at your primary site for delivering clinical trials in general. That teletrial, how we develop that structure, is part of the crucial element of teletrials. So all of this is documented in what's called a supervision plan. So as the trial is being developed, as it's being rolled out, as it's being discussed between the primary sites and any possible satellite sites, a document is developed called the supervision plan. And in that document, we document what elements each of the sites are capable of doing and will take on. It will include a plan for communication, a plan for the documentation, where things might be stored, as well as in covering where the costs might be incurred and therefore allocating the trial funding to the specific site. And that supervision plan is the largest element of the difference between simply telehealth and an actual teletrial. We know in many sites over the last couple of weeks, telehealth has been used as part of the clinical trial process to overcome the lack of COVID-related restrictions and the lack of ability to travel to the primary site. But what teletrials does, it takes it a step further and has the whole governance structure around the teletrial to make sure that the trial is delivered on an ongoing basis in a safe and controlled way. We still use telehealth as part of the teletrials. That's still how we have whatever discussions the patient might have with the satellite site or the primary site. But the difference between teletrials and telehealth is that extra governance and structures in place to make sure that things are delivered. The benefits of a teletrial are quite significant. Obviously, the most obvious is the increased access for regional rural cancer patients. Patients who previously wouldn't have traveled for a clinical trial, and it's something we see commonly in practice in regional Victoria, is patients will say, I can't travel to Geelong or Melbourne or wherever it might be because of traffic and distance I can't take the time off work. I don't have a carer who can go with me. It's too daunting. It's too much for me. So teletrials give patients that increased access to clinical trials that they would have if they were living in the city. And it's not just for regional patients. Any patient who's unable to travel, who may be housebound or may not have the capabilities of moving around the city, can avail of teletrials even within the city. As well as the obvious benefits to patients, there are benefits to the trial. So increasingly with clinical trials, we're seeing more and more niche populations that we're trying to put on a trial. Patients with a specific mutation that we need to get as many of them as we can on the trial to see if this specific medication works in this specific population. By widening the cohort that you're recruiting from, by including the 20% of Victorian patients who live outside major metropolitan areas, we're increasing the number of patients that you can put on that clinical trial. And therefore, the clinical trial will recruit faster, and it'll recruit a broad breadth of patients so that you can have a more real-world situation when it comes down to it. There are other benefits for both regional and metropolitan services in terms of having clinical trials. We know that increased in clinical trials increases the collaboration between centres. So knowing that I can work with someone in metropolitan centres on a clinical trial means that I've got that contact. I've got someone I can call to ask and say, listen, while we're here, can I ask your advice on something else? And that kind of networking and collaboration is very important in terms of developing resources and skills and education. And we know that it gives people the confidence to work in regional centres, knowing that they can still get tertiary advice if they need it. It also means that people working in the regional areas can have a better, they're better able to be trained, to be part of the clinical trial, to have that enhanced training that goes with any trial. And that means that they're more likely to be retained where they are, and you get better workforce retention in regional sites. It may also be that people working in metropolitan areas are more aware of what their resources are available in regional centres. Knowing that all the cancer centres in Victoria have a clinical trials unit that are actively working may be very attractive to some people who spend 2, 3, 4 hours a day commuting to work to get into Parkville. And that's something we may see in the future, that there will be more flow of workforce between the sites, knowing what the capabilities are. So at the moment, there are a number of different ways that we're doing teletrials. It may be a metro to regional trial, with the regional site as the main source of the main trial site. We can do it a regional to regional, that it may be between our regional cities. We have access to a trial that saves the patient having to travel from one place to another. In fact, there's even, and we'll hear a little bit about this later on, there is a phase 1 clinical trial from a major metropolitan area in Melbourne to interstate to Tasmania. But there's no limit on this. We could see a patient in rural or regional Victoria or anywhere in Australia go on a phase 1 trial in MD Anderson, for example. Once this has been set up and established and becomes our standard of care, there are no limits to what we can do. So as part of this process, what we've been working on in the VCCC is the development of this teletrials, the model, the standard operation procedures, for example, which have been developed initially in Queensland with Sabe and his group, and endorsed by COSA and other groups, and now have become adopted more widely. But also the development of the training involved. So it is a new process, and we're very slow to take up new things. But there's a module that the VCCC has developed with training so that people can become comfortable with this. We have also developed a toolkit, and this is available on the VCCC website. If you Google VCCC and teletrials, the teletrials website and all its resources will become available to you. And this tells us exactly what steps are involved in terms of developing a clinical trial, including ethics, where the documentation may be, all of those kind of questions are addressed in that toolkit. And it's a step-by-step process. Now, the reality is with any clinical trial, we go through many of these processes anyway. We go through ethics at all the different sites. We go through a plan in terms of how the document is going to be shared, or maintained so that we can be audited in the future. And this toolkit just allows you to be more specific from a teletrials point of view in when you're initiating or developing your clinical trial protocol. It's designed really, these resources are designed to make what looks like a daunting process become part of your standard of care. It may even enhance your clinical trial startup process in general, having all of these steps in place, because not all of them are specific to teletrials. And that's it from me for the moment. What I'll do next is I'll introduce you to Sabe Savison. Sabe is a clinical oncologist in Townsville in Queensland, and is probably the founding father of telehealth, if you like, and has been very heavily involved for many years now in the development of telehealth and other processes, including teletrials. He's a nationally and internationally recognized expert in the area of teleoncology. He is a clinical oncologist, a medical oncologist, and director of the Department of Medical Oncology at Townsville Cancer Centre in Townsville, as well as the clinical dean of Townsville Regional Medical Training Network, incorporating the Townsville Hospital and Health Service. Sabe has worked with COSA in terms of developing the standard operating procedures, as I said, and the telehealth model in general. So I'll pass you on now to Sabe. Sabe is going to talk to us a little bit about the current status of clinical trials in Australia and internationally.
All right. You could hear me here? All right. Thank you. So you have really covered quite a bit of the stuff I wanted to cover, so I'll actually skip those sections and go straight to the topic. All right. So this is about giving a national context. I was fortunate to be part of the COSA and VCCC and quite a lot of the national initiatives. So what we are trying to achieve is from a limited access to clinical trials and the activity concentrated in metropolitan centers or larger regional centers to provide access to clinical trials for most Australians using telehealth. I just wanted to recap what Ian defined the telehealth is before COVID, we were mainly focusing on telehealth to connect regional and rural sites and provide trial medication closer to home. I deliberately added these other components here. So as Ian said, yeah, connecting any sites to other centers. It could be metropolitan to metropolitan centers. And also now to reach patients at home. And even during COVID, and there are patients who cannot travel to a center, so providing the trial activity to patients at home, and that is the other benefit of the teletrial model. So in terms of implementing the teletrial across the country, so we have done the pilots, and we were part of Craig, Ian, VCCC, with other states. So now we learned quite a bit, which others will share it too. And I think if you want to implement the teletrial model as standard practice across the country, we have to have certain components, and players need to play their games. So the state governments, research and governance officers, they need to do streamlining of contracts, remote monitoring mechanisms, funding incentives. The trial groups need to incorporate, trial groups and the industry need to incorporate teletrial into their systems. Cancer centers need to adopt them as standard practice. And then also there's a role for other partners like cancer councils, cancer networks, Cancer Australia. So I summarized all the activities of a pilot in the last 2 years of pilot in one slide. So as you could see in the middle, the parts of the national system that's required. So we, through COSA, with support from MTP Connect, COSA Teletrial Consortium, there is a combination of trial groups, Medicine Australia, industry, consumer agencies like Rare Cancer Australia, Cancer Voices, and cancer centers, with VCCC and Monash partners. So we ran a pilot, and in Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria, and this is what happened in the last 2 years. And I feel that we have laid quite a lot of foundation for future uptake. So I start with the state governments. You could see the New South Wales, WA, Queensland all have steering committees. In Victoria, you have VCCC and Monash Partners steering committees. So at least it shows that it's been in the radar of these organizations. And in terms of governments changing some of the processes, so now Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland, they have developed their standard operating procedures, including teletrials, the supervision plan templates, teletrials, subcontracts, and also everyone is working on streamlined governance approval processes. So that's the state governments. And then in terms of the industry and the trial groups, at least 6 of the large companies have internal teletrial project teams, and the trial groups or collaborative trial groups have incorporated teletrial into their operational plans. So they are ready to go. And then in terms of cancer centers, VCCC obviously, leading this in terms of allocating 1.5 million in the last 2 years, plus all the online modules and the steering committees. The Monash partners have come on board, and then also many centers in New South Wales, South Australia, and Queensland. So as you could see, the system is in place, so we just need to scale it up. So this busy slide really summarizes the trial activities so far. I just want you to look at the summary. So total of 10 trials, or now 12 actually. There are a mixture of industry, investigator-initiated, and trial group studies. There are oral studies and medications for intravenous medications. And there are many satellite sites. At least half of them haven't done trials before. And there are more than 75 patients currently on trials. So now, as Ian said, someone will cover later. Last week, this is the Herald Sun. I actually was given this piece by Victorians. So this is about the success story of the Alfred, the world's first phase 1 trial using the teletrial model between 2 states. So it's really breaking down the state borders between Victoria and Tasmania. So what we've been able to show that all of those benefits are summarized in this slide now. So Ian was putting up the benefits, and now through our pilot, we were able to actually show that these benefits can be realized. So it creates interconnected clinical trial networks and remote medical therapy systems across the country using telehealth. Sorry about the Queensland map, because that's the only picture I had. So you could draw the circles with any sites between Victoria, within Victoria, Victoria, Tasmania, and Victoria and other states. So more satellites acquire trial capabilities, more and more rural and regional staff underwent training. There was enhanced collaboration at all levels, from clinical management, governments, and governance level. And also, there was an ability for multiple primary sites to connect to one satellite site and vice versa. And most importantly, more patients gain access to clinical trials locally. And what also became obvious was the cluster model seems to be a better way of training or enhancing the capabilities of smaller sites than purely trying to establish them as trial sites. So obviously, these extra work for the primary sites or these extra benefits and the success are not going to be easy, and obviously they were extra work for the primary sites, especially for earlier studies, sites having to set up all the processes, and then also there's additional workload for primary sites for organizing the whole clusters from the beginning to the end. But it is rewarding to work with multiple sites. It's rewarding to see patients having access, and also pleasing to see that the governance people now beginning to work together. So where do we go from here now? Certainly one of the major enablers, I think everyone is waiting eagerly for the announcement of the MRFF Regional Remote and Rural Clinical Trial Enabling Grant. But I think I have, for scaling up and sustaining in the future, and also taking advantage of the COVID initiative, I have listed the following. So all the governments need to endorse at all levels, resource them appropriately, and ideally adopt uniform regulatory reforms across the country. Number two is creating regional clinical trial coordinating centers as enabling infrastructures. So at least there's agreement within many states that each state should have at least one regional clinical trial coordinating center under each state Department of Health to take the regulatory burden off the primary sites, so that the primary sites can get on with seeing patients. Definitely there should be some seed funding for trial staff until the trial revenue comes in that can be reinvested. It also seems that there should be incentives for protocols that include teletrial as recruitment mechanisms, training and education to enhance workforce capabilities. And then also, this is an opportunity now that COVID also has given us, that there's an opportunity for developing shared care approaches with primary care and primary care trials, especially for prevention type measures. So there are a few other resources. There are links to standard operating procedures, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland Health, and also the VCCC tools. We also published the implementation of the Australian teletrial model lessons from practice pilot evidence. This is a national collaboration, free online access on the Asia Pacific Journal of Clinical Oncology for your use. So that's all I have to say, and thank you for listening, and I'll join the panel for further discussion.
Thank you, Sabe. Next, moving on, we're going to hear from Kathleen Wilkins. Kathleen is a consumer representative with the HUMRIC, but also with the VCCC, and it's in that capacity that she's been an important member of our teletrials committee for the last number of years. So Kathleen is going to talk to us a little bit from the consumer point of view about the benefits of teletrials.
Thank you, Ian. Can you hear me?
Yep, work away.
Yep, good. Okay. The consumer argument and point of view regarding teletrials is not dissimilar to what is happening in the current climate. The federal and state governments have directed the population to stay in their own homes and communities to reduce the risk of infection. This could also be a compelling reason to conduct teletrials in the patient's own community, thus keeping them close to home and reducing the risk of infection during trials. We have been compelled to rethink the way we conduct business and how we do things. This is not necessarily a bad thing, as it forces us to not become complacent and stagnant in the workplace. Technology may have been a barrier to many of us as recent as 12 months ago. However, this current climate has shown us that a new program can be learnt and used in a relatively short time when we're left with no option. The ABC News on the 28th of March stated that the government has allocated $669 million for expansion of telehealth services. This shows us that telehealth is the new normal, being offered to all patients when contacting clinics for appointments. Therefore, expansion of this type of service may become the new normal, thus making teletrials a progression and warranted service to regional, remote and rural patients. $74 million has also been allocated to mental health to assist with persons struggling with isolation. Imagine being forced into isolation away from family, friends and community whilst undergoing treatment. This is what regional, rural and remote patients are required to do if they wish to take part in the trial. The economic cost to patients undertaking a trial cannot be dismissed either, as this has a direct impact on patients' and families' mental health, worrying about the cost of travel whilst potentially not being employed due to the patient's circumstances. The current climate has forced us to rethink the way we use processes and procedures. Teletrials are no different. 5 years ago, the concept may not have been in the mindset of pharmaceutical companies or clinicians. However, now is the time to reassess. I will leave you with one last thought. Imagine if your lifespan was in days and weeks or months rather than years, and you want to undertake a trial as it was your last hope. Would you want to be away from your family and community for days or hours? This decision is what rural, remote and regional patients are faced with at the moment if they wish to take part in the trial. I thank you for listening and giving me the opportunity to address this forum, and happy to take questions in the panel.
So on the panel, we have Dr. Craig Underhill. Craig's camera's not working, but I'm told he can hear us. Craig is a medical oncologist in Albury-Wodonga, clinical director of oncology services there, as well as clinical director of the HUMRIC's Integrated Cancer Service. He's also the VCCC Regional Oncology Lead and actively involved in the development and ongoing principal investigator in teletrials. Next, we have Melanie Parkson. Melanie is a clinical research manager at Townsville Hospital and Health Service and has been at the forefront of teletrials since the initial development of the model and was involved in the first teletrial cluster in Australia. And finally, we have Cheryl Ann Hawkins, who's a clinical research manager at Alfred Health. She's the Australian ambassador for the Society for Clinical Research Sites and chair of the SCRS Asia PAC Summit 2019. She's worked in various oncology leadership and nursing roles over the last 25 years. And more recently, she's been involved in the first of the clinical trials that are interstate. She has a master's in health administration and a postgraduate certificate in oncology research and works with Monash as an educator in GCP. So welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I might start first of all with Kathleen and asking you a question from a consumer point of view. Do you think consumers are happy to have teletrials? Do you think they're happy with the quality of the service they get?
I would say yes, purely, well, for the reasons that I've already stated, that you can have your treatment close to home, close to family, friends and community, and it is reducing the cost that it takes to undertake a trial if you need to travel to a capital city. So yes, I think consumers are very happy to undertake teletrials.
I guess next question I guess is for Craig primarily. Craig, you've been a PI on both conventional teletrials and conventional trials. as well as managing patients who are on clinical trials elsewhere in terms of their toxicities. How do you think this is likely to go in the future? What's your experience?
Well, I think it's going to become a much more standard approach. I think we need to build in teletrial model into startup of new trials. Start thinking about what components of the trial could be devolved to other sites rather than the patient always having to travel in centrally. So certainly, as you've alluded to, one of the issues for some of the regional sites is sometimes the first time they hear about a trial or a patient on a trial is at midnight when they present to ED with toxicity. One of the great things about the teletrial model is that both the central and the satellite sites are aware, involved, sharing the care of the patient, aware of the protocol, able to access the protocol quite easily for information at short notice if required. So people sometimes put safety as a reason not to do teletrials, but in fact, you could probably argue that in fact it's safer to have this network in place to manage patients.
Thanks, Ray. Melanie, you've obviously set up or been involved in the first of these teletrial clusters in Queensland. From your point of view, how was it setting it up and particularly sharing documentation, for example? How have you found that?
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Really, within our northern Queensland cluster, the relationships were already existing because we've used telehealth extensively through Sarbay's work. So I think the relationships were in place, and I think that certainly helped because we had a team that were willing to discuss the documents, but in a very proactive way, that everybody was invested in taking the model forward. So I think that was a big advantage that we had when we were developing the processes, and we certainly sent everything out for feedback within our own cluster and then more widely through Chantal at COSA to all of the committees. And the other thing that we learned along the way once we'd written the steps, the steps they can be used, they are sequential, but you can also use them in tandem. But I think really they are, along with the supervision plan, the key to the success of the model, that the steps really do need to be followed. And when I've been working with new sites, giving advice across different states to different primary sites, I find that they miss things if they don't follow the steps. They may miss an important document, for instance, but everything's fixable and we find it. And then once they've done the process once, they know the process. So it's just the experienced sites, once they've used the documents, have been absolutely fine.
Good. And Cheryl, you've been involved in the getting in the newspaper recently, I guess, with this phase 1 trial with Tasmania. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So Alfred Health, we have never participated in a teletrials trial before, and as you could imagine, 6 weeks ago when we were told that we had to try and get a trial drug to our patients in Tasmania and how we're going to do it, it was quite daunting. I was luckily received funding from COSA earlier this year to employ a project manager to set up teletrials at the Alfred, and with the VCCC Toolkit and a lot of conversations between the lead HREC in New South Wales, the Department of Health in Tasmania, our own RGO and Cancer Trials Australia, we were able to coordinate the submission and the approval of the Royal Hobart Hospital within a 4-week period, which at 6 weeks ago I didn't think it was possible. But what I do have to say though is that everyone was very collaborative in the way that they approached setting up Royal Hobart Hospital, and it really has laid the groundwork for future teletrials with that hospital, with hospitals in Victoria. Our main issue was the subcontract between Victoria and Tasmania. It hadn't been reviewed or agreed upon in the past, that we got through barrier by barrier, day by day, and at the end of the day, everyone we had an identified patient, and she was a young lady, and everyone was motivated to ensure that she was dosed with her two early phase drugs in a timely manner, and that occurred 2 weeks ago. So it was an extraordinary process to go through and a career highlight for myself that would not have been possible without the project manager on site and also our RGO, Cancer Trials Australia, and the VCCC Toolkit.
Great, and well done again. I guess for all the audience, where do you see the future of this? What do you think is the next barrier that we need to overcome to make this standard of care? Abby, you want to start?
It's already, I think, the initiative, the phase 1 initiative between Alfred and Tasmania, it really now kickstarted the whole movement, I would say, because even the audience were asking, is it only for phase 1, phase 2, phase 3? But I actually never thought we will go into phase 1 territory, so now we have. So I think now the examples and feasibilities have been shown, and the documents and the processes all developed. I think the next step is really same as what happened with telehealth during COVID. When the governments came together and pushed the system from top down, the whole system moved. So I think it will be depending on the funding we get from the MRFF, plus all the other reforms the governments have to do. But in the meantime, as clinicians, we will just keep chipping away.
Great, thank you. Craig, have you anything else what do you think the main barrier is now?
Look, I think we've got some demonstration projects up and running now. There's three trials in Victoria that are actively recruiting patients. There's more than 50 patients just in Victoria gone on those. There's another one starting up this month. The barriers are often, I think, just people's concerns about safety and the governance, and it does take longer to do. We all know now from the recent experience that telehealth consultations are not perfect, and they do take longer, especially a lot of admin time. So that all needs to be supported. But I think when we're designing studies now in Australia, we should be thinking about what parts could be done by telehealth. So I think it's time that we scale it up, as Saba had said, and we start embedding it in the startup system for trials. The next iteration of our program is looking at ways that we might be able to streamline some of the ethics and governance. So when a patient's identified for a rare cancer and there's an existing protocol somewhere, we can get a rapid startup process at the satellite site so that that patient could be recruited. So at the moment, our model is, you identify sites for a study at the start, and they're all, open progressively sequentially over a short space of time, and it's difficult for additional sites to join. So we need to look at ways that we can now be a bit more clever, I think, around the ethics and governance.
Exactly, absolutely. I guess we can move on to some of the questions from the audience, and the panel can opt to answer some of these. I'll start with an easy one. How are satellite sites identified? Are they chosen in advance, or only once on eligible patients from that specific area is enrolled? I guess, Cheryl Ann, your site was obviously easy to choose because you had the patients in place. How do you think? Would you think you would have done this differently? Would you widen your relationships with Tasmania now to other trials, or what's your plan?
I think now that there's an agreed subcontract between the Tasmanian Health Department and our RGO, it has made it easy to move forward. Royal Hobart Hospital has already conducted clinical trials in the past. So to actually add another clinical trial for them wasn't as difficult as what it may be if it was a trial-naive site. If it was a trial-naive site, you would need a lot of education and training for that trial. I haven't investigated Launceston Hospital, but Launceston Hospital was closer to our patient. But we already had, the PI already had established links with the PI at Royal Hobart. So that was why we chose Royal Hobart in the end. But yeah, I think if a subcontract was able to be established through Medicines Australia, for example, that was applicable to different states, so I think that would make the process a lot easier as well.
Melanie, we're getting a number of technical questions in terms of clinical trials and where things like where the consent is done, where the paperwork, where the documentation is kept. How have you dealt with that in Queensland?
So we have a remote consent process, and I think COSA have now finalised that, and Chantal's put it up on the website, from what I understand from speaking to her last week. And so where possible with the satellite sites, if the sub-investigator is quite happy, they will consent the patient. If they want the PI present, we will be present via telehealth, and then we just follow the processes for the exchange of documents, for the signatures. We do it in real time, but there are numerous ways you can do it. And I guess with the teletrial model, even though we have all the steps and processes, we've learned as we've gone along that we've needed to look at each protocol, the requirements of the sponsor, and make a logistical plan for different elements. So the consent process might be one for a certain sponsor and a certain satellite, that you look at a process that's agreed by everyone, including the sponsor, and that's the process that you adopt for that. The IMP is another area where we've had to look specifically and produce logistical plans with third-party vendors, have to look at their credentialing, have a look at their contracts, and set it all up. So it really does depend with the sponsor, the primary and satellite site capabilities, and then it's planning. And that's part of your supervision plan, but I think what we've learned is alongside the supervision plan, there are certain logistical plans, and I don't know if Cheryl Ann had to do this, that you have to put in place to make sure that that section of this actual trial is going to be able to be conducted safely for the patient and under GCP. So that's the two requirements I'm always looking at, meeting the requirements of running the trials under GCP, and can we maintain the patient safety in whatever processes we agree.
Absolutely, and I guess that emphasises that the supervision plan is critical, and it's just a way of thinking these things through, but it's also a living document, so it's something that can be changed as we go along. As we have any experience with a clinical trial, things are going to change as you go through it, and it may be that it needs variation. Kathleen, sorry.
That's where Chantal developed that Appendix B, so that we weren't having to constantly rewrite the supervision plan. When we've had a cluster meeting, we can just use the appendix and update it.
Abby?
Yeah, one of the points I want to share with you about the supervision plan is that there is a confusion among a lot of senior clinicians. Supervision plan means that you are inferior to someone else, and that's why there is some tension between some of the metro sites, who is the supervisor. But the answer is really, it's nothing to do with who is the boss. It's all about the PI having confidence that the clusters are following the same processes. And it is just because ultimately the PI is responsible. So you could say the PI need to supervise the whole cluster, whether you are a big site or small site. So it is a safety document, but it doesn't have anything to do with personalities or egos.
Yes, egos. Kathleen, we've had a specific question for you from the audience. Do you think that there are rural or remote patients that decline trial participation based on the barriers that we've mentioned earlier? So financial, isolation, mental health, working, those kind of things?
Yes, definitely. Whilst I don't have absolute proof or documentation to verify this fact, just talking to other consumers and listening to other people, I would say definitely it is a barrier. The financial isolation, the mental health, time away, all of these things. And the other thing is that given that telehealth wasn't a common thing in regional areas, regional patients weren't offered trials. Some might have thought, clinicians may have thought they won't take it up, it's all too hard. Or if they were offered, then the consumer felt that it was all too hard as well, both in cost and time. So I would say yes, there's definitely, as I said, without documentation of proof, I would say there definitely has been a barrier to regional patients taking up trials.
And certainly I would agree with that, Kathleen. As an oncologist in regional Victoria, unfortunately, we often offer patients a clinical trial in a metro site and they decline for all of those reasons and more. We have, as I said, we have a number of questions about the specifics of clinical trials in terms of elements of the trial that you have allocated to different sites. Craig, you might want to take this one. How do you address the issues around blinding procedures for investigational products in a teletrial, particularly with things like temperature monitoring and deviations? So those kind of technical details, how do you address them in a teletrials model?
Great. Did everyone get the kookaburra before? I just unmuted when the kookaburra was in full flight. Basically, Medicines Australia's guidance around the investigational product is that the best model is probably to ship the drug to the satellite site and it's stored, dispensed and administered there, and copies of those records are shipped to the primary site. Is that the question you're asking, Ian?
Pretty much, yes. I mean, I guess it highlights again, as you were talking about earlier, Craig, with the managing the toxicities, that all of these things would be the same regardless of where the drug is being delivered. The same documentation would be required regardless of where the endpoint is. Patients will still have toxicities and still have those toxicities at home regardless of where they are in terms of where they're on the clinical trial. So many of these processes will be slightly varied.
That's right. So shipping dose by dose from the primary site to the satellite site is probably less advantageous to actually shipping the study drug to the satellite site for storing. That's the current guidance from Medicines Australia, but it's not an absolute. So,
well, I guess maybe we'll have one last question for the panel. Where do you see this going? How far do you think we can go with this teletrials model? And Melanie, maybe we start with you.
I think it has the potential really we have the processes now to open up and give that equity and access to, let's hope, most Australians. I think certainly, I don't know if it was Craig who discussed, there's much work to be done in the rare cancer space. This model is a really, really good model. And we do already work with the Princess Alexandra on a rare cancer up here in Townsville. But I think that it has the potential now to go on and really allow all Australians to have access to what potentially would give them a better health outcome. More time with the family, like Kathleen said, even when they're going through treatment, and potentially with, some of the trials that are really successful have even years rather than months longer with their family through having access to new drugs.
Caroline, having done this in a somewhat time pressure point of view, what do you see happening next?
So the sponsor of this trial was extraordinarily helpful, and they've now approached us to set up a second trial at Royal Hobart under the teletrials model. And I know they're quite keen to take this model to the USA to set up teletrials over there as well, which would be because of the situation over there with COVID. But we're now looking at a non-sponsored trial to set up also. And I don't see why it can't be a model that is implemented with any clinical trial, probably apart from the phase 1A studies. The phase 1B study was actually quite easy in the fact that it's open label. There was no blinding issues. Our next study, there is blinding issues that the sponsor is sorting out due to their own internal processes and the potential of unblinding. But you know, there's no reason why it can't be offered for any trial and every trial. And yeah, I think we need to get the sponsors on board to be able to achieve that.
Kathleen, do you think this is something that every patient will want or should ask for?
Yes, I'll be the eternal optimist and believe that this is the future of it. Cancer treatments improve all the time, so what's the difference between improving delivery of those cancer treatments? So I believe that, yes, it's something that patients, consumers will just expect in the future, that this is something that will be offered if it's appropriate for their circumstances.
Sabe, where do you see, how far can we push this?
I think now, you know, we certainly go national for all trials, including primary care trials and other fields of medicine, not just oncology. But the other thing really we have to push or expect is that the governments have to make the processes so slick and streamlined so that the clinicians don't waste time on ticking boxes.
Craig, any final words?
Oh yeah, I like the line, Ian, about all trials and any trials. I think that's where we need to get to. I think for common cancers, you want to have trials open at any site that has the capability of doing it and make the process easier and less expensive to have true multi-site trials. And for rare cancers, I think using teletrials methodology is ideal. We had an experience where in a super rare cancer, a patient with a GIST tumour with a very, very rare mutation, there was an investigational drug on phase 1 in the US, and we actually had FDA approval and ethics approval in US and Australia to ship the drug for a patient here to access that. Unfortunately, he progressed and died before, and so was unable to get that in time. But I think that's, you know, there's no reason in the future why there can't be actually international collaborations using this methodology.
Absolutely. And I guess from my point of view, I'd like to emphasize that this is not a new trial, that we're not reinventing the wheel. All we're doing is changing how we deliver that trial. In the same way that telehealth has made a big change to how we deliver oncology at the moment, it's not actually that hard. And with that, I will thank the panel, so Melanie Poxton, Cheryl Ann Hawkins, Kathleen Wilkins, Sabe Sabithan and Craig Underhill. And I thank you, the audience, for paying attention for so long. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just remind you that the VCCC's Toolkit and education is available on the VCCC website. If you Google VCCC and teletrials, you'll have access to all those resources, which will take you step by step on how to do a teletrial in terms of the training, but also has the documentation there, draft supervision plans, SOPs, etc. Thank you.